On the morning of September 10th, 2020, a crate was opened in the Barrington Tops Mountains of New South Wales, and a Tasmanian devil walked out. It was the first time in 3,000 years that a wild Tasmanian devil had stood on mainland Australian soil. The animal did not pause for that. It sniffed the air, turned and disappeared into the bush. Within hours, trail cameras around the 400-hectare sanctuary had picked up its heat signature, moving through vegetation no devil had touched. Since before the Egyptian pyramids were built, nobody told it to hunt the feral cats that had been pushing native animals toward extinction for a century. Nobody told it to clean up the carcasses sitting untouched across the bush, spreading disease into the soil. Nobody told it that the land around it had been quietly collapsing under the weight of predators it was built to outcompete. No one told it to do any of this. 3 years later, the trail cameras found something nobody had projected at this scale or this speed. What the cameras found starts with what 3,000 years without a Tasmanian devil actually looks like. Australia has a feral cat problem that most people outside the country do not fully understand. Conservative estimates put the number of native animals killed by feral cats and foxes at roughly 2 billion per year. Not a rounding error, 2 billion. That includes bilbies, bandicoots, potoroos, small wallabies, and ground-nesting birds. These species evolved on a continent with no comparable ground predator, and they have no good behavioral response to a cat moving low and fast through the grass at night. They are being eaten faster than they can breed. The Barrington Tops region had its own version of this. Forested mountains, intact canopy, and enough rainfall to support diverse native wildlife. The bush looked right from above. What had been quietly disappearing for decades was the small mammal layer beneath it. The animals that live and breed at ground level in exactly the spaces where the cats hunt. A functioning Tasmanian devil population does not stop cats directly. What it does is eat cat cubs and fox cubs when it finds them. An opportunistic carnivore, in a territory with regular devil presence, makes foxes and cats produce fewer young, move differently, and keep out of the areas where the risk is highest. That pressure, applied constantly, changes the math for every native prey species in the area. For 3,000 years, the mainland had none of that. The reason the devils disappeared was not mysterious. Dingoes, introduced from Southeast Asia around 3,500 years ago, outcompeted them. Devils do not hunt in packs. Dingoes do. The mainland population lost that contest and eventually went extinct. Tasmania had no dingoes, so Tasmania kept its devils until something started killing them from the inside. Devil facial tumor disease, known as DFTD, is one of only a handful of contagious cancers ever documented in any species on Earth. The mechanism is straightforward and disturbing. When one devil bites another, which happens constantly during feeding and mating, it transfers living cancer cells directly into the wound. The cells take hold. Tumors grow on the animal's face, then block its airways. Most infected animals are dead within 6 months of first contact. There is no known cure. DFTD was first recorded in 1996. By the time researchers understood what they were looking at, it had already moved through roughly half of Tasmania's devil population. By 2020, the wild population had fallen by up to 90% from pre-disease numbers. Around 25,000 animals remained on the island. The response was to build a captive insurance population on the mainland. Aussie Ark started in 2011 with 44 individuals, and over 390 joeys had been born by 2020. But a devil in a managed enclosure is not a wild devil. The only real insurance was releasing them. And here is the part that takes a moment to sit with. The mainland. The place that killed the Tasmanian devil 3,000 years ago was now its only safe ground. Dingoes cannot follow the disease into a dingo-free sanctuary. What wiped out the mainland population had accidentally created, across 3,000 years, the one place devil facial tumor disease could not reach. The same animal that ended the mainland devils had unknowingly protected the site where they would eventually come back. On September 10th, 2020, one of Hollywood's biggest action stars, an Australian actor known around the world for playing a Marvel superhero, reached into a transport crate in the Barrington Tops Mountains and helped guide a Tasmanian devil named Lenny into the Australian bush. Beside him, his wife, an actor herself, released another, named Lisa. The moment still carried something beyond the usual press release. Two of the most recognisable people on the planet were standing in mountain bush in New South Wales, opening crates for animals absent from this ground for 3,000 years. Tim Faulkner, president of Aussie Ark, stood nearby. He said something worth quoting directly. "In 100 years, we are going to be looking back at this day as the day that set in motion the ecological restoration of an entire country." That is a specific claim, not a platitude. A claim about what 11 animals in a sanctuary of 400 hectares were about to do to an ecosystem. The preparation had taken a decade. Aussie Ark had been running its breeding program since 2011. 44 founders, 390 joeys were produced and raised in conditions designed to preserve wild behaviour. No hand feeding, minimal human contact, exposure to live prey. The 11 selected for the first release had been matched to avoid inbreeding. Trail cameras were positioned throughout the sanctuary. The monitoring plan was in place. What the plan could not account for was the animals themselves. The cameras were running. The team stepped back. For the first 8 months, they watched and waited. The first monitoring check in May 2021 was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. 7 joeys had been born in the wild at Barrington Tops. Not in an enclosure, not under veterinary supervision, in the bush, inside the pouches of females who had been living wild for 8 months and had found everything they needed without anyone showing them where it was. The last time Tasmanian devil joeys were born wild on mainland Australian soil was approximately 3,000 years ago. Tim Faulkner said they had been working tirelessly for the better part of 10 years to return devils to the wild of mainland Australia. Once they were back in the wild, it was up to them. It had been 8 months. They had produced 7 wild joeys, the standard conservation projection for a species reintroduced after a 3,000-year gap into unfamiliar habitat with animals that had never navigated wild country would not predict successful wild breeding in the first year. The models accounted for adaptation time, territory establishment, and learning. They did not account for animals that simply remembered what to do. By 2023, 21 additional adults had been released. Lisa, one of the 2 devils released by the celebrity couple on September 10th, was found during a routine pouch check to be carrying 3 joeys of her own. The wild population at Barrington Tops was growing. The births, as remarkable as they were not what made the monitoring team stop the trail camera footage. Something else had changed in the bush around the sanctuary, and it had started before the joeys. The joeys were one signal. The cameras around the sanctuary were picking up another one, and this one had started before the births. Within the first year, cameras in areas where devil presence was regularly documented began showing something the monitoring team had expected in theory, but had not seen confirmed at this speed. Feral cat activity in those areas started dropping. They were not disappearing. 400 hectares is not large enough for that, but the cats' movement patterns shifted. They started avoiding the zones where devil scent was strongest, and the frequency of their incursions into the core sanctuary areas fell. Tasmanian devils do not commonly hunt adult cats. What they do is eat cat cubs and fox cubs when they come across them, which is what any opportunistic carnivore does with a vulnerable juvenile competitor. Apply that consistently across a territory, and the cats and foxes start producing fewer young, move into less productive ground, and spend more energy just staying away. The pressure on every native prey species below them eases. Native bandicoots were recorded at Barrington Tops in 2022, in areas where they had not been documented for years. Eastern quolls, small carnivorous marsupials that had been functionally extinct on the mainland for decades, were reintroduced to the same sanctuary in 2021 and began establishing alongside the devils. The land was not just gaining a devil, it was starting to reorganize around one. Whether this holds outside the managed sanctuary at landscape scale is still being tested. Barrington Tops is 400 hectares. That is a proof of concept, not a solution. Aussie Ark's plan involves expanding connected protected areas across the eastern forests of New South Wales. A timeline Tim Faulkner describes without irony as 100 years. The cameras are still running. In Tasmania, the same year that Barrington Tops joeys were born, devil facial tumour disease was still spreading. Researchers had been developing a vaccine. Some individual animals had shown heritable resistance, a sign that evolution was running slowly against the cancer. But 25,000 animals is not a large number for a species. A contagious cancer that spreads through biting in a species that bites constantly while feeding is a hard problem to outrun genetically. The Mainland program had become something more than a reintroduction. Every joey born wild at Barrington Tops is an animal that exists outside the disease zone. Every successful breeding season on the mainland is insurance that did not exist 3 years ago. This is the part that is hard to sit with. The dingoes that wiped out the mainland devil population 3,000 years ago are the reason the mainland is now the safest place on Earth for the species. A dingo-free sanctuary on a continent that has not held wild devils in 3 millennia is the one location where devil facial tumour disease cannot follow. The thing that killed the mainland population accidentally created, across 3,000 years, the only refuge left from a catastrophic disease. That is not a conservation plan. That is just how it went. Aussie Ark's goal is not limited to Barrington Tops. The plan is to expand connected protected areas across the eastern forests of New South Wales. Eventually, a landscape where wild-bred mainland devils can move and breed as a true wild population. Tim Faulkner's 100-year claim is a programmed timeline, not rhetoric. In Tasmania, the disease continues. On the mainland, the cameras keep recording. Both things are true at the same time. On the morning of September 10th, 2020, a crate opened in the Barrington Tops Mountains, and a Tasmanian devil walked into a bush it had not touched in 3,000 years. The cameras picked it up within hours. 3 years later, those cameras had recorded 7 wild joeys born in the first 8 months before anyone expected it. Feral cats shifting out of areas where devil scent was strongest. Native bandicoots in spaces that had been silent for years. Eastern quolls back on a mainland that had been without them for decades. A population growing without being fed, managed, or guided. The 11 animals released that morning did not know they were part of a 100-year plan. They did not know the species had been absent from this ground for 3,000 years. They did not know about the disease working through their last wild population on an island 300 kilometres south. They went into the bush and did what Tasmanian devils do.